Module 4, Expressions, Linear Equations, and Linear Inequalities. In this PowerPoint video, we'll look at Section 4.2, Properties of Real Numbers. There are several properties of real numbers. The first two we're going to look at are commutative and associative. They're both defined for addition and for multiplication, although they're very similar. The commutative property has to do with the order that you complete the operation. For addition, it's defined as A plus B is the same as B plus A. Multiplication looks very similar. A times B is the same as B times A. It just means that you can add the numbers in any order or multiply in any order, and you'll always get the same answer. Usually with commutative, we think about commuting, like going to and from work. Assuming that you take the same route, the miles driven in will be equal to the same driven back. Associative property has to do with grouping. Think of when you have associates at work or at school. They're also defined for addition and multiplication. The quantity of A plus B, find that first and then add C. You'll get the same sum if you add B plus C first and then add A. For multiplication, you find the product of A times B and then multiply that by C. You would get the same answer as if you found the product of B times C and then multiplied by A. So groupings for associative property and order for commutative. Notice that the order in the associative property didn't change. It's A, B, C, A, B, C. The order did not change. Use the commutative or associative property to complete. Well, I have x plus 8. I can use the commutative property and say 8 plus x, and that would be the commutative property of addition. In B, I can use the commutative property of multiplication and say x times 7. Since I have parentheses in C, I'm going to use the associative property. Instead of adding 8 plus 1 first, I can add 3 plus 8 first, and then add 1, and I would get the same answer. I can use the associative property of multiplication in D by saying 4 times 2 first, and then multiplying by the negative 5. Notice that the negative 5 was still up front. I didn't move it to the back. If I changed it to 4 times 2 times the negative 5 at the end, I would have used both properties. I could change the associative property here as well and say x times y times 18. I could also use the commutative property, though, if I wanted to, and say 18, and then times x times y, and take that whole grouping at once. One of the most commonly used properties is the distributive property, whose whole name is the distributive property of multiplication over addition, but we usually just say distributive property. This is the paperboy delivery. You have this number out front, which in the next section we'll learn is called the coefficient, and this will get multiplied by B and then get multiplied by C. That's why it's multiplication over addition. We'll have identity properties for both addition and for multiplication. The identity for addition is 0. You can add by 0 all day long and you won't change the number. So the identity property for addition is A plus 0 is equal to A. 1 is the identity element for multiplication, and so you can multiply by 1 all day long and not change the number. And so the identity property for multiplication is A times 1 is equal to A. Little hint for knowing the difference of when you're using that identity property to another one is that in the identity properties, you're using the identities. Right? You're adding them, you're multiplying by them. They're being used, they're in with the variable. Let's use the distributive property to rewrite each of the expressions that we're going to see without the parentheses. I have 7 times the quantity x plus 4y. So 7 times x is 7x, and 7 times 4y is 28y. If I want to distribute 3, I have 3 times the negative 5, 3 times the 9z, multiply, I get a negative 15, 3 times 9z is 27z. If you don't see a number outside of the parentheses, but there's a sign, or even if there isn't a sign, then there's an invisible 1. So I'm going to take this little invisible -1 and multiply that by each term inside the parentheses. So -1 times the 8, -1 times the x, -1 times the w. Now I have a -1 times an 8, well that's a -8. -1 times x is a -x, but negative w times a -1 is a positive. Anytime you have a double negative when you're multiplying, that will turn something to a positive. Additive and multiplicative inverses will seem a lot like the identity properties, but this is what you're going to use to find the identity. So the additive inverse is the opposite of the number. So a plus -a is going to be a 0. So for example, 2 plus a -2 is 0. When your answer is the identity, that's the inverse property. Notice that it's away, it's on the other side of the variables. If it was a plus 0 is equal to a, that's the identity property. If you're equal to the identity, that's the inverse property. The multiplicative inverse, well, in order to get the identity, if you have a number, you have to multiply by 1 over that number or the reciprocal of that number. So b times 1 over b, remembering that there's an invisible positive 1 underneath every whole number, would give me b over b, which is of course just 1. So let's see if we can name all of our properties. The first one. 5 times the quantity x plus y is equal to 5 times x plus 5 times y. We can see that the 5 has been distributed to the x and to the y. So this is going to be the distributive property of multiplication over addition, but we usually just say distributive property. Next, n plus 0 plus 9, that's equal to n plus 9. Well, I'm going to say associative property because I have n and then I'm going to say plus 0 plus 9, which is just 9. So n plus 9. So let's say associative property. -5 times the quantity x times 11, and now it's equal to -5 times 11 and then times another x. Well, this is a little sneaky. If I swap this order first in here, I get -5 times 11 times x. So that would be commutative property inside of the parentheses. But then I've also changed the parentheses, and I regrouped it and said -5 times the 11 and then times x. So this is commutative property and associative property for multiplication. So I have 2 there. D, I have 5 plus the sum of x plus y. And then it's changed to the sum of 5 plus x and then plus the y. And since the order stayed the same, it's 5xy, 5xy, but the groupings changed, this is only the associative property for addition. E is a -3 times a -1/3 is equal to a 1. 1 is the identity for multiplication. If the identity is alone on one side of the equal sign, then you are talking about the inverse property. In order for it to be identity property, it would have to be in with the other number next to it. You would have to be using it to be the identity property. But this would be the inverse property for multiplication, since we're multiplying. -5 plus a +5 is equal to 0. Again, 0 is the identity for addition, but it's alone on one side of the equal sign. So this, again, is the inverse property. To be the identity property for addition, it would have to look like something like 5 plus 0 is equal to 5. Those can be a little sneaky. Those are all your real number properties.